aside their internal grievances. But around 2008, you had a couple of key factors that we now better appreciate contribute to domestic terrorism or domestic extremist movements. You had a financial crisis. Every wave that we've seen of domestic extremism, it's usually precipitated by some sort of financial crisis. It creates a grievance, right? It creates a frustration with the situation that many people might be in. We also were coming out of a war. That is another known contributor. It doesn't mean necessarily that the veterans were coming home and becoming extremists. It's it's a little more complex than that. It's just having the country be war weary and frustrated, and there was a lot of frustration, particularly around the Iraq War, and feeling that it was a war we shouldn't have been in, and that kind of created some grievance as well. And then we also had the election of our first Black president. And I really wish, when I did this research, I really wish it was just the first two. I wish it was just the financial crisis and a period of war that led to the spike in extremism. But there really is, the evidence was pretty clear that having a first Black president created either opportunities for extremists to exploit unwitting people who, and when I say unwitting, I think it's fair to say that certainly older generations lose some of their biases more, and it's more difficult for them to let go of perhaps what they grew up with. So there are no doubt witting racists in our country still today, and there were definitely present in 2008. But what you saw occur is that various systems and structures found dog whistling ways to make the fact that we had our first Black president an issue. And probably the best example of that is the birth certificate argument, or using his middle name very prominently, kind of implying that he was actually, that President Obama was actually Muslim, and implying that we should be fearful of having a Muslim as a president because, you know, we were about 8 or 9 years post 9/11. So there were a number of factors that various actors tried to exploit, and those grievance structures kind of set in, and it kind of resurged the extremist movement. In particular, we saw increases in militia membership, and we didn't see a spike in attacks until the mid-2010s, but by 2015, if you look at charts showing the number of attacks and plots going back to 1994, you can look at, starting at 2015, we start to see a pretty dramatic shift upwards. And the other piece that we didn't quite appreciate, because when you have a trend starting, you can't really see the trend until several years of data come in. So it was probably 2018, 2019, where we're like, the threat has morphed and changed. And it has changed in the way that, for example, ISIS attacks, and there was a shift from an Al-Qaeda model of complex coordinated attacks, and ISIS being much more like, hey, you don't need to come and get trained by us, just grab whatever weapon you can get your hands on and go create chaos. Go use a car, use a knife, use a gun, and kill as many people as possible in our name, and you're doing jihad, and we'll get credit for it, right? So there's this massive shift in what foreign terrorism was doing, but at the same time, we started to pay attention to this domestic terrorism movement. And when you start to look at the data, you realize actually the attacks and plots coming from domestic terrorists has stayed higher than anything ISIS or Al-Qaeda did, with the exception of 9/11. And there's a bit of a reckoning for the community. Now, granted, the counterterrorism community and the executive branch we're doing the job that Congress told us to do, right? Congress passes the law, they give the budget, and we're all told, go make sure Al-Qaeda can't hit us ever again. Go protect our infrastructure so that it's a harder target. And we did that. But we should have seen that we had actually more attacks and plots coming from Americans or from people that were residing in the United States than we did from ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't still try to protect from ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliates who still would love to cause us harm. Like, that's still a threat in the homeland. But today, the most lethal and prevalent threat comes from domestic extremists, and in particular, extremists which academics label as right-wing violent extremists. Now, the government doesn't use that term, but academics use that term. And specifically, white supremacist extremists and anti-government extremists. Those are the most likely to lead to mass death compared to any other form of domestic extremism, including the far left, which tends to focus more on disruption to services or property damage. They tend to not do attacks with the purpose of killing. So those are the threat vectors that we're facing today. The challenge that we have in trying to educate Americans on that is that it became so politicized during the Trump administration. And it's part of the reason it made my job hard. When I was responsible for counterterrorism at the Department of Homeland Security, we were grappling with what was happening, trying to understand the trends. And what normally would happen is a president would turn to his cabinet secretaries, sign an executive order and say, go figure this out, go figure out what's happening, why we're seeing a mass attack in El Paso on a synagogue in Pittsburgh, what happened in Christchurch, New Zealand, using very similar themes as what we saw show up in El Paso. Go figure this out. Usually the president doesn't come up with the solutions. He just tells his people, go look at this and then come tell me what we should do. And we had the opposite happen. We had a president who could not call it domestic terrorism. I had a meeting in the White House shortly after the El Paso attack and was told we were trying to get some funds for the Department of Homeland Security to do more on domestic terrorism. And the people I was working with, thankfully, totally understood and agreed with our approach. And they, not so subtly, said, so when we brief the president, we're going to talk about this in terms of violence prevention. And I responded with, hey, I understand, and I appreciate that you are going to navigate what you need to in order to get to the yes. I am going to, and I know my boss, who at the time was Secretary McAleenan, we're going to call this what it is. It is domestic terrorism. And we're not going to mince words about that. We have a domestic terrorism problem. And that's just, it's a small thing, but it's just kind of the example of where you are dealing with incompetence and somebody who's derelict in duty. Your job as president is to keep Americans safe. Like, that's really it. There's a lot of other interesting things you can do, but constitutionally, the main reason we have a federal government is to provide for the national defense. You're supposed to keep us safe. And he absolutely refused to acknowledge that we even had a problem.
It is so scary. And,